Mr Kelly.
Well, I suppose it is a debate, but I don't think we've disagreed very much so far, which some people will think is a good thing, but I think in a democratic chamber it's good to have sometimes contrary opinions. I wish to offer some contrary opinions, I think, in my speech, and I wouldn't want to disappoint my colleagues on the nationalist benches in that respect. But there's never been any doubt in my mind about the impact that Scotland has on the world. I've had the opportunity to travel far and wide in my professional life, and it never fails to astonish me, the reach that our country has around the world. There's something about the very idea of Scotland, the very idea of Scottishness. And there's been some comments made about romanticised imagery, but that romanticised imagery has a powerful influence in the way that many people see our country. Scotland captures the imagination and the hearts of people. And like many of you, I am both proud and grateful for that. There's also no doubt that Scotland and Scottish are, Willie Rennie alluded to this, they are valued brands the world over. And they can coexist, in my view, with institutional loyalties and localised loyalties. In fact, the more people have different connections to Scotland, the better. Because we need to maximise that franchise. And we need to build on what we have. The diaspora, in how we use it, is, of course, the essential component of this. We've heard about the 40 million people with Scots ancestry around the world. And beyond that, there are many millions of people who feel a strong affinity with Scotland. And we all have stories about meeting people in the most unlikely places, in distant lands, who proclaim their affinity to Scotland. And generations on, they are still Scots at heart. But there's one group of people who have already been mentioned, but I'd like to touch on them again briefly, because they will spend the rest of their lives, if we do our job properly, being Scotland's unpaid ambassadors at large. And that's the international students who choose to make Scotland their home while they study here. Now, it's true that international students in Scotland make a huge financial contribution to our country. They're a massive export industry in their own right. And more so than ever, we need them. Because, as Willie Rennie mentioned, this SNP Scottish Government have been very willing to cut the funding that goes to Scotland's universities, and at a cost. They are leaving our institutions, I think, vulnerably dependent on international students. The paid tuition for domiciled Scottish students doesn't even cover the teaching costs that go with each student. So international students are a source of vitally important revenue. Their tuition fees are underpinning Scotland's universities' finances.
Daniel Johnson.
For giving way, and I think he makes an important point, because I think it also leaves our universities vulnerable, because while they're so dependent on international students, who are very much welcome, play a huge contribution, but if those patterns change, it could leave our universities in a very precarious position indeed, which they were almost in during lockdown, and it is something I think we all need to think about collectively. I wondered if you'd agree with that point.
Daniel Johnson, I agree with Daniel Johnson, and he cites correctly the examples of the shock of COVID, and then the further shock of the Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And there are great uncertainties in the world at the minute, particularly around China and Taiwan. And we should be mindful of all of these things. The Minister is busy heckling and making some unhelpful suggestions. I think I will take an intervention from him if he wishes.
Cabinet Secretary.
I just sought to add to that list of unfortunate events the impact that Brexit has had on our international students coming here and studying in Scotland.
Stephen Kerr.
I'm sorry, but that is the usual utter nonsense from the government front bench, because the statistics prove otherwise, Minister Gray. They prove otherwise. We have record numbers of international students coming to the United Kingdom and indeed to Scotland. And we are the beneficiaries of that. So many red herrings to deploy in this debate, and usually they begin with B and end in T, Brexit. I'm afraid it's nonsense. The Scottish Government have been reckless with our universities, and that's why Daniel Johnson is absolutely right when he talks about the vulnerabilities that currently exist. But according to a recent article in the Times, the international students are worth £7.75 billion to the Scottish economy. But beyond this financial calculation, these international students are a soft power asset that circumnavigates the planet, a flowing tide of goodwill to be celebrated and harnessed. And when you speak to an international alumnus of a Scottish university who has returned home, as many as will have done, and they make a life for themselves, the very mention of Scotland brings a smile to their faces. That's an important power that can work for our advantage if we harness it. They love Scotland, and they are some of the great proponents of Scotland and the great salespeople that Scotland has. In fact, the greatest salespeople that we could ever hope for. The idea of a Scottish higher education is known around the world, and our universities are renowned not only as being among the very best in these British Isles, but as being world-class. And in a similar but separate vein, I will forever remember walking into a convenience store in the middle of Tokyo and seeing a whole section of the shop display devoted entirely to Scottish produce. Scotland's food and drink sector is a massive cultural ambassador in its own right. Take, for example, Scotch whisky. In the past year, Scotch has sold record amounts of exports, over £6 billion, making up 25% of the total UK food and drinks export. And I mention this as it is a reminder to my friends in the United Kingdom government that when Scotland's unique heritage, industry, beauty and cultural independence is embraced by British institutions, then British reputations are embellished. But like any good relationship, the Union also empowers Scotland through the UK's membership of NATO, G7, G20, the Five Eyes, and our permanent membership of the UN Security Council. Scotland's voice is heard at the top of international affairs, as are Scottish voices. With 162 embassies and high commissions around the world, as well as 190 consulates and 35 other diplomatic representations, our position within the United Kingdom allows us to project Scottish influence at all levels around the world. And British embassies are there representing the best of British, and that obviously means that they must represent and should represent and do represent Scots and Scotland.
The member is actually going to be closing his remarks quite shortly. Thank you. I have said there's extra time in hand. That doesn't mean that every single member gets to speak for endless periods of time. Thank you. Mr Kerr, please continue and please start to wind up.
Well, I can't take the intervention.
Yes, but I'm happy to indicate that as the management of this debate falls on my shoulders, I would like you to continue with your thoughts, but bring them to a close.
I will bring them to a close. So I will bring them to a close by saying that these comments I've just made lead to significant questions. What is the SNP's true motive for spending scarce resources on new separate offices in foreign capitals when we aren't maximising the asset value that we already have in the presence of British embassies? And why did Angus Robertson need to be called out? Well, I'd love to, but I'm afraid I can't.
I've already explained. Mr Kerr is concluding his remarks. Could Mr Kerr please conclude his remarks? Thank you very much, Mr Kerr. Thank you, Mr Swinney. Mr Kerr.
And why did this is a debate now. And why did Angus Robertson need to be called out for posturing?
Mr Kerr, you really need to conclude your remarks. I hope we're on that trajectory now. Thank you very much, members. Thank you. Mr Kerr, please conclude.
Do I have a minute left to conclude?
I would give you 30 seconds, Mr Kerr. 30 seconds, please conclude.
30 seconds to conclude. 30 seconds to conclude. Well, let me conclude by concluding that question. Angus Robertson shouldn't need to be called out for posturing as a foreign minister, which he isn't, and holding official talks on matters which are reserved. So I'd say to the Cabinet Secretary in conclusion, don't waste the Scottish public's money. Don't do that. My colleague Maurice Golden is right to call for greater transparency and accountability throughout the Scottish Government's international work.
Thank you very much. I think we've kind of worked out
Well, we were
the
having a
conclusion.
debate, which is a revelation in this place.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. Thank you.